The Galactic Council had heard some pretty ridiculous distress calls in their time. There was the incident with the sentient space whales who turned out to be particularly dramatic about their mating rituals. Then there was that whole mess with the crystalline beings who thought their planet was under attack when it was just a meteor shower. But this was shaping up to be the most absurd waste of resources yet. "Let me get this straight," Commander Vex said, his three eyes rolling in perfect synchronization as he reviewed the report on his datapad. "A survey team lands on some backwater planet called Kithara, and they're running away screaming about monster roars?" Dr. Quillen, a nervous Zeltharian whose tentacles had an unfortunate habit of twitching when he was anxious, cleared his throat. "Well, sir, the survivors did seem genuinely terrified. They described sounds that, quote, shook the very foundations of reality, unquote." "Oh, please," Vex scoffed, his mandibles clicking in annoyance. "These exploration teams get jumpier every cycle, probably just some large predator with a decent set of lungs." Pip, the youngest member of their crew, and still enthusiastic enough to volunteer for everything, bounced slightly in his seat. "But sir, what if it really is something dangerous? The reports mentioned explosions too, and the settlement was completely destroyed." Vex waved a dismissive appendage. "Explosions, roars, complete destruction? Sure. And I suppose next you'll tell me these monsters have mastered interstellar travel and are planning to invade the council chambers?" The truth was, the council had been looking for an excuse to cut the exploration budget anyway. Times were tough, and frankly, they'd discovered enough habitable worlds to last several millennia. What was one more rock with some noisy wildlife? "Look," Vex continued, "we'll send a minimal rescue team. 3 beings, basic equipment, in and out. We'll document whatever oversized lizard is making these sounds, evacuate any remaining survivors, and file a report recommending the planet be classified as a restricted wildlife preserve. Problem solved." Dr. Quillen's tentacles twitched faster. "Are you sure that's wise, sir? What if the survivors weren't exaggerating?" "Quillen, in my 200 years of military service, I've learned one universal truth. Scared civilians always make mountains out of molehills. These monsters are probably just territorial and loud. We'll bring some sonic dampeners and call it a day." What none of them realized, of course, was that the survey team hadn't been exaggerating at all. They'd just been spectacularly wrong about what they were hearing. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. 3 days later, their ship descended through Kithara's atmosphere, and even Vex had to admit the planet looked more disturbing than he'd expected. What should have been a thriving survey outpost was now a collection of scattered debris and suspiciously geometric blast craters. "Well," Pip said, pressing his face against the viewport, "that's not exactly what I'd call typical predator damage." Dr. Quillen was already running scans, his tentacles working frantically over multiple control panels. "Commander, these readings are unusual. The blast patterns are too precise, too organized, and the metallurgy of the debris suggests exposure to extremely high temperatures." "So the local wildlife learned to breathe fire," Vex said, though his confidence was starting to waver. "I've seen stranger things." "Sir," Quillen's voice cracked slightly, "some of these metal fragments have been melted and reformed. The energy required would be substantial." As if summoned by their conversation, a deep, thunderous roar echoed across the landscape. It was followed by a series of rapid, explosive sounds that made their ship's hull vibrate. Pip's enthusiasm dimmed considerably. "Okay, that's definitely not a normal animal sound." "It's coming from those cave systems to the north," Quillen reported, his scanner beeping frantically. "Multiple acoustic signatures, highly coordinated. Commander, I'm reading at least a dozen distinct roar patterns." Vex felt his military pride kicking in, despite his growing unease. "A pack, then. Probably communicating about territory or hunting strategies. We've dealt with pack predators before." Another roar split the air, this one closer and somehow more organized than the last. It was followed by what sounded like rhythmic chanting, though the words were incomprehensible. "Did that sound like language to anyone else?" Pitt whispered. "Don't be ridiculous," Vex snapped, though he was thinking the same thing. Animals don't have complex communication systems that sophisticated. Dr. Quillen's tentacles had gone completely still, which was never a good sign. "Commander, I'm detecting structured patterns in the acoustic emissions, mathematical relationships between the roars, timing sequences that suggest intelligence." The three of them stood in silence as another series of roars echoed from the caves, followed by more of those explosive sounds and what definitely sounded like coordinated shouting. "Right," Vex said finally, his pride winning out over his common sense. "We're going to investigate. Whatever's in those caves destroyed a council outpost and is clearly intelligent enough to be a threat to future colonization efforts. Sir, Quillen protested, perhaps we should call for backup first? Backup? For some oversized cave dwellers who got lucky against an unprepared civilian survey team. Vex's mandibles clicked dismissively. We're trained military personnel. We'll study their behavior, document their capabilities, and develop appropriate countermeasures. What Vex didn't know was that the creatures in the caves weren't planning to hunt anything. They were just trying to figure out why their practice grenades kept echoing so much in this particular cave system. But our alien friends were about to learn that the hard way. The cave system was everything you'd expect from a monster lair, if you were the sort of person who'd never actually seen a monster lair. Dark, echoing, and filled with the kind of ominous sounds that made sensible beings turn around and go home. Unfortunately, none of our 3 heroes qualified as sensible. The acoustic signatures are getting stronger, Dr. Quillen whispered, his scanner practically vibrating with activity. Multiple distinct voices, highly coordinated movement patterns. I can hear them, Pip breathed, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by the kind of nervous energy that makes people do stupid things. They're chanting something. What they were actually hearing was Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, running the 47th Marine Training Battalion through their morning exercises. But context, as they say, is everything. Pretty much, move, 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 echoed through the cavern, followed by the thunderous sound of boots on stone. Dear Cosmos, Vex muttered, they're organizing for an attack. Who's ready to blow stuff up? Came another voice, met with enthusiastic roars from what sounded like dozens of creatures. Dr. Quillen's tentacles had gone completely rigid. Commander, that sounded like tactical coordination. They're planning something. The truth was, Private Jenkins was just really excited about grenade training. But the aliens didn't know that. They crept deeper into the cave system, following the sounds around a bend, and that's when they got their first glimpse of the monsters that had terrorized an entire survey team. Humans. Just humans. Running around in camouflage gear, carrying weapons, and treating the whole thing like it was the most normal activity in the universe. Rogers, you magnificent bastard, one of them shouted after a particularly impressive explosion. That's how you clear a room. What in the name of the 7 nebulae are those things? Pitt whispered, staring at the creatures who were casually discussing the finer points of explosive placement. The humans were completely oblivious to their audience. They were too busy arguing about whether C4 or thermite was better for breaching operations. You know, typical human stuff. Dr. Quillen was frantically taking readings. They're bipedal, approximately 2 meters tall, and they appear to be, Commander, they're treating explosive devices like recreational equipment. All right, ladies, Sergeant Rodriguez's voice boomed through the cavern. Time for live fire exercises. Remember, these rounds can actually kill you, so try not to be stupid. The aliens watched in horror as the humans responded to this death threat with laughter and what appeared to be genuine excitement. Did he just warn them about mortal danger and they cheered? Vex asked, his 3 eyes wide with disbelief. Jenkins, you're on point. Martinez, cover the flanks. Everybody else, try not to shoot each other again. Again? Quillen's voice cracked. They've accidentally attacked their own pack members before? What followed was the most terrifying display of casual violence the aliens had ever witnessed. Humans running through combat scenarios, shouting encouragement at each other, and treating weapons that could level buildings like sporting equipment. Beautiful work, Garky. That headshot would have dropped a rhino. Thank you, Sergeant. I've been practicing on the range. They might practice killing? Pip whispered. For fun? The final straw came when one of the humans ran out of ammunition, and, instead of retreating or showing any sign of concern, simply shouted the word that would haunt alien nightmares for generations to come. Not a roar of desperation, not a cry for help, just a casual announcement that he was going to grab more tools of destruction and get back to having fun. The 3 aliens looked at each other with the kind of dawning horror usually reserved for cosmic revelations. They weren't watching monsters. They were watching something far worse. They were watching a species that had weaponized recreation. The 3 aliens huddled behind a rock formation, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. It was like discovering that your neighbor's hobby was juggling antimatter for stress relief. Okay, Vex said slowly, his military training warring with his basic survival instincts. So they're not monsters, they're... what, exactly? Dr. Quillen was reviewing his scanner data with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your calculations prove the universe shouldn't exist. Based on their physiology and behavior patterns, they appear to be an undiscovered sapient species. But Commander, their approach to violence is unprecedented. How was that explosion, Martinez? Echoed from the training area. Could have been bigger, Surgeon. That's the spirit. Next time, use more C4. Pip was staring at the humans like they were a mathematical equation that had just solved itself by setting itself on fire. They're critiquing each other's destructive capabilities, like it's an art form. It gets worse, Quillen whispered, his tentacles twitching as he analyzed more data. I'm detecting elevated heart rates, increased endorphin production, and neural activity patterns consistent with enjoyment. They're actually having fun. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council had spent millennia developing increasingly sophisticated methods of conflict resolution. They had entire departments dedicated to peaceful negotiation, diplomatic protocols, and non-violent problem solving. And here was a species that had apparently decided to skip all of that and go straight to making warfare into a recreational activity. Beautiful grenade toss. Rookie, you're getting the hang of this. Thank you, Sergeant. I've been working on my throwing arm. They're encouraging each other, Vex said faintly. They're actively teaching their young how to be more effective at violence. Dr. Quillen's scanner beeped with a new reading. Commander, I'm detecting multiple weapons caches throughout this cave system. They've turned this entire area into some sort of training facility. A training facility, Pip repeated. They built a place specifically designed for practicing how to kill things? All right, everyone, time for urban warfare scenarios. The aliens watched in fascination and horror as the humans began setting up what appeared to be a mock settlement, complete with cardboard buildings and strategic obstacles. They were literally creating fake environments to practice destroying. This is beyond anything in our xenobiology databases, Quillen muttered, frantically taking notes. They've institutionalized combat training, made it systematic, organized, efficient. I'll remember, in urban environments, watch for civilians. What if there aren't any civilian surgeons? Then you're probably in the wrong place, Jenkins. The casual nature of the conversation was what really got to them. These weren't hardened warriors preparing for an imminent battle. They were regular individuals who had apparently decided that learning 17 different ways to breach a door was just part of a normal Tuesday. They're not even at war, Vex said, his voice hollow with realization. There's no enemy force, no immediate threat. They're just practicing. But practicing for what? Pip asked. That's when Dr. Quillen's tentacles went completely still again. What if this is how they live? What if their entire civilization is built around the assumption that violence is not only inevitable, but something to be mastered? The thought hung in the air like a particularly ominous cloud. The Galactic Council had encountered aggressive species before, but they were usually driven by resource scarcity, territorial disputes, or religious extremism. This was different. This was violence as a cultural norm. Okay, people. Scenario time. Martinez, you're the squad leader. Garkey, you're the enemy. Which enemy, Sergeant? Foreign military? Terrorists? Allied invaders? Surprise me. The aliens looked at each other with dawning horror. Not only did these humans practice violence recreationally, they had apparently imagined so many different types of conflict that they needed to categorize them. Alien invaders, Quillen whispered. They've already considered the possibility of fighting extraterrestrial forces. As a training exercise, Vex added numbly. For fun, Pip concluded. The worst part was how competent they were. These weren't bumbling amateurs playing with dangerous toys. These were clearly skilled, disciplined, and frighteningly effective at what they did. They moved with precision, communicated efficiently, and treated equipment that could level city blocks like it was basic sporting gear. We need to make contact, Vex said finally. The Council needs to know about this species before they discover interstellar travel. Are you insane? Quillen's tentacles were practically vibrating with anxiety. What if they consider first contact a training scenario? But it was too late. The decision had been made for them, because at that exact moment, Private Jenkins looked up from cleaning his rifle and said the 5 words that would change everything. Hey, did you guys hear something? If there was ever a moment when the universe decided to demonstrate its twisted sense of humor, this was it. 3 terrified aliens hiding behind a rock, watching what they believed to be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and a human soldier who thought he'd heard something unusual during weapons training. Nobody move, Vex whispered, as if the laws of physics would somehow make them invisible if they just held really still. But Private Jenkins was persistent and curious, and unfortunately for everyone involved, he was also the kind of person who investigated weird noises instead of ignoring them like a sensible individual. "Sergeant," Jenkins called out, "I think we've got company." "What kind of pumping, Jenkins?" "The kind that's been watching us from behind that rock." Dr. Quillen's tentacles went through what could only be described as the biological equivalent of a complete system crash. "He detected us." "How did he detect us? Our stealth technology is state-of-the-art." "Maybe because you've been whispering loud enough to wake the dead," Pip muttered. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there, because Sergeant Rodriguez, being a professional military instructor, did what any reasonable person would do when told that unknown entities were conducting surveillance on a training exercise. He treated it like part of the training. "All right, people. Looks like we've got ourselves a real-world scenery. Unknown contacts, possibly hostile, conducting reconnaissance." "Oh no," Vex said. "This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." "Oh no, Quillen added. "Martinez, Garkey, flank left. Jenkins, Rodriguez, take point. Let's go say hello to our visitors." "We're doomed," Pip concluded. The aliens had two choices: run like sensible beings, or attempt diplomatic contact with a species that had just declared their presence a military exercise. Unfortunately, Vex's pride kicked in at exactly the wrong moment. "We're council representatives," he said, standing up with as much dignity as a three-armed alien could muster, while surrounded by heavily armed humans. "We should handle this diplomatically." What followed was the most catastrophic first contact in galactic history. "Whoa!" Jenkins shouted, pointing his rifle at the suddenly visible aliens. "Sergeant! They're not human." "I can see that, Jenkins. What gave it away, the tentacles or the extra eyes?" Dr. Quillen, in a moment of what could charitably be called academic enthusiasm, stepped forward with his universal translator. "Greetings, unknown sapient species. We come in peace and seek diplomatic relations." What the translator actually said was, "Salutations, mysterious war creatures. We arrive in violence and desire combat arrangements." The humans paused. The aliens paused. The universe itself seemed to pause to appreciate the magnificent absurdity of the situation. "Did that thing just challenge us to a fight?" Martinez asked. "I think so," Garcia replied. "But politely?" Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been dealing with military bureaucracy for 20 years, recognized the signs of a communication breakdown. "Hold your fire. These might be some kind of training simulation." "Training simulation," Vex whispered to Quillen. "What does that mean?" "I think it means they believe we're part of their combat practice," Quillen whispered back, frantically adjusting his translator. "Oh, that's just perfect," Pitt muttered. "They think we're training equipment." The translator, apparently deciding that the situation couldn't get any worse, chose that moment to malfunction spectacularly. Instead of translating Quillen's attempt at peaceful clarification, it began randomly spouting military terminology it had picked up from listening to the humans. "Tactical insertion successful. Requesting immediate extraction. Enemy forces have superior firepower." The humans looked at each other with the kind of expression people get when they realize they've stumbled into something way above their pay grade. "Are these things military?" Rodriguez asked. "We're talking like military," Jenkins replied. "But they look like, I don't know. What do they look like?" "Aliens, Sergeant. They look like aliens." And that's when the situation went from merely disastrous to completely insane, because Rodriguez, faced with what appeared to be extraterrestrial military personnel conducting some kind of training exercise, did what any good sergeant would do. He decided to be helpful. "All right, listen up. Alien, military personnel. If this is some kind of joint training exercise, nobody told us about it, but we're happy to participate." "Joint training exercise," Vex repeated faintly. "We've got plenty of ammunition and targets. What kind of scenarios are you folks interested in running?" The aliens stared at the humans. The humans stared back expectantly. Somewhere in the distance, a training grenade exploded, because apparently the universe had decided that the situation needed a soundtrack. "I think," Dr. Quillen said slowly, "they're trying to recruit us." "For what?" Pip asked. "Combat training," Vex replied, his voice hollow with disbelief. "A training exercises," Rodriguez continued enthusiastically. "This is great. We've never had alien participants before." And that's when Private Jenkins, with the kind of timing that would make comedy writers weep with envy, decided to demonstrate human hospitality by offering their new alien friends some refreshments. Seagreen, should I break out the armies? Our guests might be hungry. Good thinking, Jenkins. Nothing says welcome like military rations. Dr. Quillen looked at his scanner, which was now registering stress levels that weren't supposed to be possible in living organisms. Commander, I think we need to leave. Now. Agreed, Vex said. Pip, start backing toward the exit. Slowly. Don't make any sudden movements. But it was too late, because the humans, in their infinite capacity for making every situation more complicated than it needed to be, had decided to make this official. Martins, get on the radio. Call base and tell them we've made contact with alien forces. Allied? Martinez called back. They're wearing camouflage and talking tactics. They're obviously military. The aliens looked down at themselves. They were in fact wearing standard Council exploration gear, which happened to be a mottled green and brown pattern designed to blend in with various planetary environments, which, to human eyes, looked exactly like camouflage. This is not happening, Quillen whispered. Oh, but it is, Pip replied. We're about to become the first diplomatic team in galactic history to accidentally join an alien military. And that's exactly what happened. 3 days later, Commander Vex stood before the Galactic Council, looking like someone who had stared into the abyss and discovered it was doing jumping jacks. His official report was spread across the holographic display, and every single council member was reading it with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your pet had learned to speak and its first words were a declaration of war. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, High Counselor Thranks said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying very hard not to laugh or scream. You encountered a species that practices warfare as a recreational activity. That's correct, Your Honor, Vex replied, his 3 eyes still showing signs of what Dr. Quillen had diagnosed as acute cognitive dissonance. They have entire facilities dedicated to simulating combat scenarios. For fun. And when you attempted diplomatic contact, they assumed you were military personnel? Yes, Your Honor. Apparently, our standard exploration gear resembles their combat uniforms. They immediately classified us as allied forces and attempted to recruit us for something called joint training exercises. Counselor Blix, an elderly Vorthan whose species had spent the last millennium perfecting the art of peaceful meditation, raised a trembling appendage. Commander, in your report you mentioned that they stockpile explosive devices and refer to them as recreational supplies? That's correct, sir. They have entire storage facilities filled with what they call ammunition. When I asked what it was for, they said, and I quote, blowing stuff up. When I asked why they needed to blow stuff up, they said, and I quote again, because it's awesome. The council chamber fell silent except for the sound of Counselor Tremack quietly hyperventilating into a breathing apparatus. Dr. Quillen, still twitching from his experience, stepped forward with his datapad. If I may, Your Honors, I've compiled a complete behavioral analysis of the species. They refer to themselves as humans, and their approach to conflict resolution is unprecedented. How so? High Counselor Thranks asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure, she wanted to know. They've developed over 3,000 distinct methods of combat, categorized by environment, opponent type, and available resources. They practice these methods regularly, compete with each other to improve their efficiency, and they've turned the entire process into a form of entertainment. Entertainment, Counselor Blix repeated faintly. Yes, sir. They have competitions to see who can be more effective at simulated violence. They award prizes for excellence in combat techniques. They've gamified warfare. Pip, who had been unusually quiet since their return, finally spoke up. Your Honors, there's something else. During our interaction with the humans, I observed their social structure. The individual giving orders, their sergeant, was genuinely concerned about our well-being. When he thought we were military personnel, he offered to share their food and provide training resources. Anyone wanted to help you become better at violence? Counselor Tremack wheezed. Yes, sir. They were genuinely enthusiastic about it. They kept saying things like, the more the merrier, and safety in numbers. They seemed to think we were there to learn from them. High Counselor Thranks leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just been told that mathematics had filed a complaint against logic. Commander Vex, in your professional military opinion, how dangerous is this species? Vex considered the question carefully. Your Honor, they're not dangerous in the traditional sense. They're not aggressive or hostile. They're actually quite friendly. The problem is that they've normalized violence to such an extent that they can't imagine why anyone wouldn't want to participate in combat training. Imai invited us to stay for something called a barbecue, Quillen added helpfully. Apparently, after explosive training exercises, they gather to consume charred animal flesh and discuss tactical improvements. Females socialize about warfare, Counselor Blick said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir, they treat it like we would treat a poetry reading or a scientific symposium. The council members looked at each other with the kind of collective realization that usually precedes either enlightenment or complete mental breakdown. Your Honors, Vex continued, I need to emphasize that the humans are completely unaware that other sapient species exist. They have no concept of galactic civilization, no knowledge of the Council, and no understanding that their behavior might be considered unusual. They think this is normal, High Counselor Thranks said, slowly. Yes, Your Honor. To them, this is just Tuesday. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that speaks volumes about the cosmic joke that is existence. Finally, Counselor Tremock spoke up. What do you recommend? Commander Vex straightened his uniform and delivered the recommendation that would become known throughout galactic history as the most sensible decision ever made by a military officer. I recommend that we classify the human star system as a restricted zone, level 7. No contact, no observation, no interference. We put up warning beacons in 17 different languages and pretend we never found them. Seconded, said Dr. Quillen immediately. Thirded, added Pip. Motion carried, High Counselor Thranks announced. The human system will be marked as Restricted Zone 7, with the official designation inhabited by species that weaponized recreation. Do not disturb. Ever. And that's how humanity earned the unique distinction of being the only species in galactic history to be quarantined not for being dangerous, but for being so enthusiastically violent that they made the entire Galactic Council nervous. Meanwhile, back on Kythara, Sergeant Rodriguez was still wondering what had happened to those friendly alien military personnel who had disappeared right before the barbecue. He'd been looking forward to comparing tactical notes. Shame they had to leave, he told Private Jenkins as they packed up the training equipment. They seemed like our kind of people. Think we'll see them again, Sergeant. Probably not, Jenkins, but hey, at least we know we're not alone in the universe. That's true, Sergeant. Think they'll come back with friends? Rodriguez paused, considering the possibility of more alien military personnel showing up for joint training exercises. I hope so, Jenkins. I hope so. The universe, meanwhile, was quietly filing this entire incident under things we don't talk about at parties and moving on with its day.